வணக்கம் நேயர்களே, இது வெளிச்சம். இன்றைய வெளிச்சத்தில் முன்னாள் பிபிசி ஊடகவியலாளரும் ஸ்டில் கவுண்டிங் த டெட் என்ற நூலின் ஆசிரியருமான திருமதி பிரான்சிஸ் ஹாரிசன் அவர்களை சந்திக்கின்றோம். பிரான்சிஸ் ஹாரிசன் அவர்கள் அம்னஸ்டி இன்டர்நேஷனல் மிக முக்கிய ஊடக பொறுப்பாளராக இருந்தவர். அதே நேரத்தில் ஆக்ஸ்ஃபோர்ட் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் ஒரு விசிட்டிங் ஃபெலோவாக இருந்தவர். இப்பொழுது இந்த புத்தகம் எழுதுவதற்காக எல்லா பணிகளும் வந்து ஓய்வெடுத்திருக்கின்றார். எஸ், ஸ்டில் கவுண்டிங் த டெட் இஸ் very incredible narrative, extremely moving, very touchy, traumatizing at times. I know the book had attracted lots of attention from all sorts of people you have criticized in the book. UN, Tigers, Sri Lankan government and the international community. But in the sense that the survivors are the most important ones. You have interviewed at length many of them, thousands of them you have interviewed, and it has never been to the world that the truth has been exposed in such a manner, in such depth, like your book.
Well, thank you.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for that. Now, take us to the beginning. What inspired or what made you to take such a task on?
Well, obviously I was connected with Sri Lanka. I'd lived there for 4 years. I still had friends there. Right through the war I talked to Pulidevan because he was on Skype and he would chat with me, and then obviously I watched him walk to his death at the end, and I kind of half of me knew that might happen, and so that was a shock, but then not a shock. And then I kind of waited. I saw a lot of refugee journalists Tamil and Sinhalese that I knew from Sri Lanka turn up in London, and I waited to see who would deal with this. I thought the international community would sort of put things right or deal with this situation. And a year went by, and I didn't really see that it was my business to do that. And I couldn't see what my role was at all. And then I was talking to a friend who'd written a book about Bangladesh, about the war there in 71. And it suddenly sort of, the penny dropped, and I thought, okay, right, that's what I can do as a writer. I'm not affiliated, I wasn't affiliated with any organisation at that point. And I thought, okay, I can tell stories, I can write, I can research. Let me try and write about what happened in that time in the war that we just don't know about, when there were no independent witnesses there. Yeah. No UN, no aid workers to speak of, no foreign journalists. So I started to phone people, and I wasn't even sure if there would be enough people outside the country to do, and I knew I couldn't do it inside the country. And I found the first few, and they referred me to others, and I went sort of dotting around the world, finding people like that. And I was shocked, even I who had watched the stories and, knew the country, I was really, really shocked by what I found.
Yeah, how did you come about connecting all the people that you have interviewed, the survivors and all that, so that you have already had their contacts, or
no?
So you just planned it out after this?
No, I knew from the exiled journalists, Tamil and Sinhalese, that there were survivors coming out, and this was a year after the war, right? It took people a long time to come out, and I knew, and to reach the West, I knew that there were quite a few expatriate Tamils who'd been caught up in the war, so people who were dual national and had a passport or had nationality, and they were, I think, the ones who got out fastest. And I knew then that there were others coming. And so I didn't know how many there would be. I was told there were about 20 or 30 probably out. And so I thought, okay, well, it's something to start with. And of course, as I did the book, more and more people started to come. And really, I would meet one survivor and they would introduce me to their friend, or they would say, no, if you're going to this country, you ought to go and meet so-and-so. He's got an interesting story. And so it was like that. And then when I went to Australia, I just managed to get inside Villawood Detention Centre, and I just said, who's Tamil and who was in Mullawaikul in 2009. It was that simple. And there were lots of people who left before that, and I was like, nope, I just want the people who were there in 2009, and I would talk to them. So, it was quite easy to find people, and now I think it's even easier. I think if you ask any asylum lawyer, Tamil asylum lawyer in London, they would have hundreds of these cases and people who witness these things.
But these kind of stories have been widespread among Tamil communities. The Tamil academics and Tamil media people, they'll all know. But they were not able to bring this out, either the reluctance on their part that, what is going to happen that by bringing them out themselves, because the international community, they will always label every Tamil diaspora or or expatriates as Tiger sympathizers, and they will not merit the story, even though it has the truth in it, right? So, do you think that once you met these immigration lawyers and all that,
I didn't actually do it through the lawyers, but I know that now you could do it that way.
One of the so they immediately trusted you, and then they just the trust has to be developed before they pass on the information, right? But here we have seen since '83 there were lots of similar survivors of calamities like that, and they would necessarily come out and then share their stories, either because they wanted to go back to Sri Lanka because of fear, or simply because nothing would happen by saying all these things, because we have been saying these in Tamil medias for years and years, and nothing had happened. So this is the first time that I think Western, in a sense, that even though Channel 4 medias like that, they brought out some segments, but it's not as comprehensive as your book is, right?
I think there's a number of issues around this. I think, for one thing, survivors of Mullawaikul, they want to tell their stories. They want people to know what happened, and I think there's quite a bit of distrust of everybody, but of other Tamils too. Some of these people don't want to be engaged with Tamils. They don't know who to trust in the diaspora.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And it's easier to tell the story to an outsider, a foreigner, because basically I'll go away again afterwards, and they won't have to see me every day, or in the community, or at events, or in the temple, or whatever it is, or weddings. And that some of this stuff is quite shameful and quite horrible, and it's not things that they want to remember or be reminded of. And what I've seen in many countries, that the Tamil survivors of Mullawaikul, they come and they end up in, say, Paris, and they don't speak French, and they need a local Tamil who's been there for some years to help them maneuver around offices and get settled. And there are incredible people in the diaspora who've just sort of become self-appointed social workers in a way, and they take these people under their wing, and they take them around and get them settled and help them physically get organized. And those people are sort of unsung heroes too. But those people, they feel they're imposing if they say, now I've helped you, now tell me all your story, And they wait for the survivor to tell them a bit, and sometimes they tell them, sometimes they don't. But because they're meeting every day and they're kind of sitting and having meals together and so on, it's not really a dinner party conversation, this stuff. It's pretty horrible. And they don't want to kind of tell all that. So I think it's quite difficult to tell your own people that stuff. It's like people who go through traumatic things don't want to tell their parents or their husbands or their children. It's difficult to tell people who are close to you. Sometimes it's easier to tell people who are not are distant.
Yes, and in some cases, like some taboos, like if a young Tamil woman was raped, and then if she had shared the story with the Tamil, it has a different meaning than sharing with you, right?
Yes, I mean the last chapter of my book is about a girl in London who was raped, and she, the condition of the interview, which was quite difficult to set up, was that I could not bring any Tamil with me or any translator with me. Actually, she spoke perfectly good English. She'd grown up in Colombo, and it was that I would not contact her again afterwards, and I would leave her alone. I would go once, hear her story, and then disappear. And she feared desperately the stigma of rape in the Tamil community, and she said, they will gossip about me and my life will be ruined. I mean, it was already ruined, but it would be further compounded, the abuse in a sense, and the trauma for her. So obviously being a woman interviewing somebody who's raped is easier. Well, I mean, not for me, not for her, but it's more comfortable in a sense. But being an outsider was absolutely essential and key to that particular interview.
There was another anecdote, could be true, could be not. Several young women in detention now after Mullawaikul, the ex-combatants, they preferred to be sent outside the country rather than sent back to Jaffna or where they came from, because of the society will not take them back as though they were just before they set out to for their cause, you know.
Yep, I've seen the story. It was reported from Sri Lanka. It was a very interesting story about these girls who were in detention. You know, they were former tiger fighters, and then when they were sent home, I mean, the families wouldn't accept them back, or the villages or the community, because they assumed that they'd been raped or sexually abused or had some kind of, you know, illicit relationship with police, soldiers, whatever. And also because I guess they brought extra scrutiny on the family, that the security forces will come and question and say, okay, you've got a tiger in the household, you know, what's going on? And the other siblings become endangered by that. And it's a really sad thing that Tamil society doesn't support the victims of rape. And I mean, goodness knows how many there are after 2009. I mean, we've had it throughout the war, but I think, and I write about this in the book, but I think that what happened at the end of the war in Sri Lanka with rape was probably much worse. You know, we will probably never know how many women were raped because of the stigma around it, but I think it was quite serious and much more than before. And those poor people, I mean, you know, you hear the suicide rate's gone up. It's almost that's the only decent, honourable way out of rape, is to try and commit suicide. And the woman that I interviewed in London, who was totally apolitical really, she and my mother, and she was actually pregnant at the time, and she lost the baby, and she was gang raped in the police station in Velicham. And you know, she could never tell her husband, her mother, her sister, anybody what happened to her. The way she expressed it was trying to kill herself twice. It was so that they would understand what had happened to her, and they knew, but they could never ever discuss it. And you know, she goes through life frightened of every single man she sees on the street. And she said that, and you know, frightened of her husband. And she said that it was better in London because at least there weren't security forces and army and police everywhere. But in Velicham it was terrifying.
Was she getting any psychological help or assistance?
She'd had a bit of trauma counselling in London, and I mean, it was clear to me she needed more, and I told her that I thought she ought to go and access more and how to do it. But then I sent her a text message telling her where she could go and get it, and I never heard back from her. I think it was just like once she talked to me, she didn't want to have anything more to do with me. Not that she was angry with me or anything, but that she wanted to protect that herself.
It's understandable. In your book, your first chapter was captioned, titled "The War the United Nations Lost." I have a bit of a point to raise on that. United Nations was considered as by the people there and diaspora as the savior of our people, at least to start with the principle, with the mandate. But in the end, in not only your book, but the report that came out acknowledges that they have nevertheless being seen as slept with the enemy, right? So in that respect, that title, you should have mentioned the United Nations that won the war.
Well, I mean, I wrote that chapter well before the Petrie report came out, and of course it would have been nice to have had the Petrie report when I was writing it, but I mean, that report corroborates and more what I'd written at the time. And actually when I wrote that, I was, kind of quite alone and out there saying these things about the UN because nobody had really looked at it. But what I meant by the title, which it's not meant to be kind of taken too literally, was really that they lost it in the sense that their mandate was protection too. It's not just about humanitarian assistance. They should be protecting civilians, stopping them from being killed.
That's right.
And in that sense, they lost it. They lost their reputation.
Same as the same thing applies to International Red Cross as well. Would you?
I mean, I think the International Red Cross has a very different mandate, and they don't speak out much about wars, and that's how they get into jails, that they don't do that. They're very, very tight-lipped, and obviously as a journalist that's a bit problematic. I wish they were more open about things sometimes, but you kind of have to respect their role and what they do and they don't do. And actually they did issue some fairly strong statements. They warned of catastrophe, and they said at the end of the war that this was one of the worst wars. They'd seen a lot of wars, and this was one of the worst they'd ever seen in terms of human suffering, civilian suffering. So I don't think I think their local Red Cross staff, the Tamils who stayed in the war, and after all, 2 of them died on those beaches. They were pretty brave. They did their best to try and evacuate the wounded, but obviously it was a drop in the ocean.
So,
and I guess also there's something else I should say is that you talk about the UN as if it's a sort of monolith organization, but remember that there were Tamils who worked for the UN, and there were some lower ranking, not the very senior diplomats, but some field staff who actually were quite brave. If you think about Peter MacKay, who was on Convoy 11, some of the other staff left and he stayed, and he stayed to try and get the Tamil staff out, and they risked their lives. They were very lucky to escape actually with their lives.
Yeah, I heard many stories of the ground workers from the UN, local workers. They want to stick with the victims, and then they want to stay back, and then there was incredible tales of
bravery.
courageous,
I think so, and I think those people haven't been honoured in any way for what they did, and then you take Dixie, the guy in the beginning of my UN chapter, who's now writing a graphic novel about the book. But he came out, he was horrified, he saw what was coming, and he had to abandon his staff, and he said it was the worst day of his life, and he came out and he resigned. That's doing the right thing.
But why? You mentioned that he was gagged. He was told by you and not to speak out again.
I mean, now
we've had the mandate to stop an ex-employee.
Well, they have. I guess they have employment contracts and so on. I don't know.
Probably.
You have to ask him why and how they did that.
But he never spoke out after that. That's it. That was.
Well, he's spoken out repeatedly. He's just given interviews in the last week.
Oh, okay. I see.
He was on the BBC. He's written for Grand Views. He's all over the place.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this coming back to the UN as well. Again, the UN has been. I think it's been seen to be serving two masters. One is for the international community. They have been feeding them, and Sri Lanka, that has a leash on that. If I bring an analogy of a dog has been fed by the not in a derogatory term, right? But it's been fed by the international community, and then the leash was in the hands of the Sri Lankan government, and that was handled. The handler of the dog was handled very, very well, right? So in this case, do you think the UN was subdued by the handler, more against the principles and the mandate of the UN protocol?
Well, I'm not sure I can kind of really cope with the analogy, but I think what you see is unfortunately a few senior UN staff who suppressed information, basically about the conduct of what was happening in the war. The information they did have, they probably didn't have the full extent of the horror, but they had some, enough to have potentially made a difference to public opinion. I mean, whether if the world had known what was going on, as they now know in Syria, for example, whether they would have acted is another question, but you at least have to give them the information and then you see what happens. So I would have liked that information to have been out there in the public domain at the time when they had it, not now, 3.5 years later. So, that's really problematic for me, that they, as Charles Petrie puts it, they told the international community what they wanted to hear. In the world of prescription and tigers being branded as terrorists, they told the world that they assumed that the tigers were the ones doing all the killing, and it actually wasn't that way at that point. So, I agree with Charles Petrie's kind of analysis in a way of it, but I think I would go further and question, why they did that, why nothing has happened to those people who had those posts now, why they still work in conflict, if in his report he says they weren't experienced enough, and what the UN is going to do to put it right now.
Exactly. And now, if say the justification of the UN's behavior at the time of the final few days of the war, right? Then obviously the international community has been being informed right to the point through WikiLeaks and all that, whatever you mentioned in the book. If they are right, they have been informed of the exact number of casualties. They have been referring to Tamilnet reporting, Lokison's reporting, and they have the full assessment of the situation.
I don't think they had the full assessment, but they had enough information, because the full assessment we don't have today. We don't know how many people are dead, we still don't know that. But I think they had quite a lot of information about what was going down at the time and how serious it was. But, you look at the UN, and in one sense it's only as good as its member states and the pressure from the member states, and if they don't want to take action and they've sort of signed off on this at a certain level, then it's quite difficult for the Secretary General and the entire UN system and machinery to go against the members that make it up.
Yeah, okay, assuming that was the case, after the Molivakal, everything is gone, and the panel report came out, and then still, according to Matthew Lee of United Nations, the Secretary General was still adamant that he was promoting promoting the general, Sri Lankan general, to be a peace monitor or a head of the peace corps, right? So within the United Nations. So that means that he's still taking the side of the Sri Lankan government, or at least he doesn't want them to be seen as a war crime committers or something. Why would he still continue to do that? Okay, so we have admitted that this bungled, and then we have to rectify it. We have to find bring some justice to these victims, but it still seems to be behaving as though there's nothing happened. So that comes to the next question. The report came out. The report either could have been brought out because they were against the wall, there was no point of return, and then they have to come out with some kind of excuses, or as a result of soul searching. Which one do you think that that might have been the case behind?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the report was instigated because it was a specific recommendation of the UN Panel of Experts report. It says that Ban Ki-moon should initiate an internal inquiry, so he did. And then the report came out, but it came out, in a quite strange way because it was leaked first, and then they had to rush forward with the publication. But then they removed the executive summary, which put it in the context politically, and then the UN redacted portions, which particularly the portions that dealt with very senior officials in New York and their role, and they bungled the redaction, as you know, and you could copy and paste these things, and a website, Sri Lanka Campaign, put it all over their website, and then they took it off the internet in the UN, and then they stuck it back up properly redacted, having then drawn attention to all the bits they were sensitive about, which was, not the most, glorious moment, really.
Yeah.
And I think, then you have to ask, there are interesting bits in the report about Ban Ki-moon's role, insofar as it says that the Office of Legal Affairs advised him that he had the power to appoint an international independent investigation into war crimes, but he obviously didn't do that. We know that now. I think now when you look at the report, obviously the UN is full of different individuals. Some probably want more, stronger action, and some are breaking it and acting as a brake and not wanting to do that. And you see that even in the inquiry, if you read it carefully, there are people who are talking about whether the UN would be complicit if they didn't act on the information, and others arguing a different way. And obviously, like any big institution, it's full of different people pulling in different directions. So it's not just one organization in a sort of totalitarian state. But I think the issue is now that we've got this report. It's a pretty good report. I think everyone agrees it's a good piece of work, and it sets the record straight. It explains why the world didn't take more action, didn't know enough perhaps. And now what are you going to do with it? Well, the Secretary General's office appears to be looking as if it wants to use this report as sort of ammunition to take action on Syria. And you can't really argue with that because people are dying in Syria today. And, people are not dying in the same way in a war in Sri Lanka. So yes, if it helps, never again and all that stuff, if it helps to learn lessons for Syria, great. But if that's all it is, it's a bit unfortunate for Sri Lankans who, with a learning process for this, if indeed anything is learned, which we don't know yet, it would be nice if Ban Ki-moon could, go back and address some of these issues with Sri Lanka. So not just the Geneva process, the Human Rights Council and the resolution, but something a little stronger. And, maybe you could even meet some of the survivors from Levicham, the kind of people in my book. Wouldn't it be nice to, they've acknowledged a grave failure, some mea culpa, but actually it wouldn't be bad if they met the survivors, because I think it's quite a life-changing experience if you meet these people and you talk to them and you hear face to face this appalling stories of survival and endurance. And it's not something that you can just kind of forget if you hear those things again and again. So actually, I think the way to change things and for people to take notice, to meet those people and to hear that.
Supposing if there was a war crimes inquiry or something, it's extremely difficult to
envisage.
Bring this. These survivors that you had interviewed, would any of them be willing to appear at the interview?
Well, I think there's ways of doing it. These people, a lot of people talked to the UN Panel of Experts, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, from the ones that you interviewed?
Well, some of them, but not all of them. But, a lot of other people talked to the UN panel. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on, witness protection and all that. But there are ways of doing this, and it's not the first country where, these issues have come up. So there are ways of, hearing testimony in camera, that kind of stuff. And I don't know, it's possible that in the future they might be willing to do that. You know, some people are increasingly wanting to talk. I mean, Velicham has spoken in public.
Has he? Okay.
Yeah, in Europe, he's been in address meetings with the Sinhalese journalist, Bashana. They've gone together to brief people in parliaments or to talk occasionally. So, you know, it is a huge risk for people to come out into the open. It's a huge risk to talk to me for my book and to be published like this. And they have a lot to lose.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like,
but the quest for justice and the sense that they owe it to the victims. I mean, I think, you know, these people spoke because they want the world to know, but it's not that they want the world to know how they suffered particularly. They want the world to know about the people that didn't make it out, the dead, the ones who will never be alive to tell their stories. And they feel that they survived, and they wonder why, you know, they're guilty. They wonder why on earth did I survive and not him. That's just totally random. And they justify it in their minds by saying, I've survived so I can tell everybody what happened.
Incredible. In the meantime, that like you said, I think Beate Arnstedt movie, there was the woman that one of the Black Tigers' mother, she was tracked down and killed by the Sri Lankan government. That was Beate said at the interview. So any of those people, if they, you know, they come out, and, you know, just to save the future generations and all that, you know, they have the legitimate reason not to come forward, and by that they will allow the war criminals to escape, you know, or whatever. Yeah.
Well, you know, we're not at a war crimes trial. We're very far away from that. So let's see what happens if it ever comes to that, whether people are willing to come and talk or not.
Okay, coming back to that, like I said, you know, there were 4 parties that you have heavily criticized in this book. Tigers, Sri Lankan government, United Nations, and the international community. Has any of them come back swinging at you?
No, I mean, not really the international community as such, because I don't know which bit of it would come back at me, and the UN, not particularly. No, I can't think of anything. And if anything, I think, you know, some people in the international community and the UN are, you know, supportive about it, and the fact that the story is being told. The government of Sri Lanka, I mean, there have been a few, you know, remarks on Twitter and a few newspaper articles and things, but that's kind of par for the course. It's what you expect. In fact, you know, you might expect more, and that's what I got when I lived in Sri Lanka too, if not worse. So I don't feel it's particularly out of the ordinary, you know. And on the Tamil side, you know, as you know, there are some people who've said that the book depoliticizes the struggle and the story, and that it should sort of wave the flag of Velicham and the LTT more, which it's not going to, because that's not who I am, and, you know, I don't know why that should be the expectation. But, you know, they're entitled to their opinion, and it's fine. I accept that that's their view. I don't mean to offend anybody, you know, especially people who have lost a lot of, you know, mourning and all that. It's not meant to be disrespectful of the dead. You know, that's the... No. I think you should be able to criticize the LTT without being, you know, disrespectful of the fact that they're not here anymore. And it's not meant to be like that. So, you know, everybody's entitled to their opinion. For everyone who criticizes it, there's somebody who likes it. And
yeah, as long as all 4 parties criticize you, that means that you have done a wonderful job. Well,
that's what they always say in the BBC, if everyone criticizes you, you're doing a good job. But it's probably not that simple, is it? But, you know, I did what I think is an honest job from my perspective, and I'm who I am, and I see things the way I do. If I was, you know, I was born and brought up in the Vani, and I was, you know, my life experience was different, my perspective might be different. You know, what can you say?
We heard something about, something had happened at your book launch in London. People mainly Tamils who attended that launch, or
mainly,
what happened?
I guess, yeah.
Has anything happened that was critical of your publication, or?
Well, I don't think it was particularly critical of my publication at the launch, because it was actually the launch, so I don't think that many people had actually read the book by then. And I just read a small portion of the doctor's story, and then we had a kind of presentation of what other people are doing, you know, to tell the story of what happened there. So I invited other people to come and present their work that they're doing, because I thought
other
it'd be
people
nice.
From Tamil.
No, I mean as in other foreigners and outsiders.
Okay.
I wanted the Tamil community to know that they, you know, other people were trying to tell the story in different ways, and for them to be aware they weren't kind of alone in that sense. So I read a bit from the doctor's chapter, and then a girl called Christine Bacon, who is part of a drama group called Ice and Fire. She came and explained how she's trying to turn the book into a stage drama in London. She has a drama company called Ice and Fire, and they're turning it into a play called The Island Nation, which will come out in time probably for the CHOGM meeting, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting next year. So she told the story of how she'd met me and how she'd been reading the very early manuscript. I emailed her a couple of the chapters, and how she'd been walking along the road on the way home and she kept bumping into people because she was so shocked reading it. So it's sort of nice. She's an actress, so she's good at telling those stories. And then we had a bit from Benjamin Dix, known as Dixie, who's in my book, who's the UN man. And I didn't know him at all before I went to interview him, and we kind of gradually became friends. And he read. Is
he based on London too?
He's in Sussex, but yes, near London. And he read the early draft of the book, and because he'd lived in Kinloch, I wanted his view and whether what he thought about it. And he decided that he was doing a degree at the time, and another one, and he was then decided that he would. His contribution in a way, because he's still quite haunted by all this stuff that he was part of, would be to work on a graphic novel. So he's trying to tell the story of the end of the war with a cartoon family, but a really serious one, like Joe Sacco's Palestine or the Persepolis novels about Iran. And a family who goes through Moulay-Eichel, and then the father goes abroad to London, and the scenes of him meeting his asylum lawyer and flashbacks to the horror of the war. So it's a very long-term project that because you have to draw each scene. But he's kind of mixing it with video and still photos, and he was a photographer, and so it'll probably take several years. But it's interactive and on an iPad, and he's soliciting donations to kind of keep that going and make that work. And it's a very exciting and interesting project. And then the other person we had to come and talk was Callum McRae, who's the Channel 4 Killing Fields producer, and he played a snippet of his trailer for his new movie and talked about how he's making a new film, and he was appealing to people to come forward if they had new evidence or interviews, things that he should know about. So that was the kind of first part of the. Sorry, I'm getting to the question.
That's fine.
The first part of the launch, which involved me, and then I sort of rather kind of was a bit reticent. I thought, okay, I'm part of a whole group of people who are trying to do this. It wasn't kind of me. And then I had Eric Solheim, Yasmin Sukha, and I invited Alan Keenan because I thought it'd better to have a human rights act kind of group person who knew the current situation, who'd written about the problems now as opposed to 2009. And I invited them to have a panel discussion with Stephen Sackur. So that kind of happened, and I wasn't really part of that. I was in the audience. And Stephen Sackur, I think the bit where people got upset was when Stephen Sackur asked Eric Solheim about his role in trying to mediate some kind of surrender in 2009, which I've written about, which I didn't know about, of course, at the time until later when I was researching this. And whether the Tigers should have agreed to a surrender in January, February, whether indeed it was even possible, whether the government would have accepted it. There are so many whethers and ifs with all these stories. And people felt that he was being somehow critical of the Tigers. And he did say that, look, although I'm not in any way exonerating the government for what it did and for its responsibility, that it's, the primary responsibility lies with the government for killing all those people. And actually he mentioned the word war crimes for the first war crimes trial, which I had never heard before from his mouth. So they missed that because they were so annoyed about what he said about the LTT and surrender. And then, so I think, with him there were a lot of people who went back and asked about the peace process and all the failings and the role of Norway. And, I understand people are really angry, they're angry, they feel abandoned by the international community, and he was the one politician standing there. And so they,
he was
quite
the
hostile.
representative of the international community.
I suppose so. I don't know. There's a lot of trauma and anger and emotion about this war for everybody. I totally sympathize with that. And people felt angry towards him for all sorts of reasons, different reasons perhaps, who knows. And so he got quite a kind of hard time, I think. And eventually at one point he said, look, I'm the only minister in Europe who really, took any notice of the issue in Sri Lanka, and I couldn't do it alone. The rest of Europe didn't want to know. And, he said you want us to intervene, and when we do, then you attack us and all this kind of stuff. So it got kind of a little heated. But, you have political meetings in London. This was in the Amnesty auditorium, and the Amnesty staff was saying this is nothing compared to what you get on Israel-Palestine. So, people, it's good if people can express themselves, and they had a chance to debate with him. And although, they also listened to Yasmin Sukha, who's a very different kind of person because she's much more mild in her tone, and she's a lawyer, not a politician. She's less blunt and less direct, but she's also an extremely good speaker. And she said there for the first time that it was possible that 75,000 people could have been killed, which was, another kind of top line, as it were, in terms of what came out of that debate. And, she spoke very well as well. So I think, it was a pity that some people said it was a pity that the focus wasn't more on the people now in the Vani or in Jaffna and their suffering now, and more it went back to sort of 2002-03. But, obviously that was what the people in the audience wanted to hear, I guess. They wanted to question him and grill him about why he failed in the peace process, I suppose. I mean, it was a bit frustrating. We couldn't have had more time, actually. Somehow we lost a lot of time. It would have been better for the discussion to have gone on and to have dealt with the present day as well.
So the role of the Norway, the people that were present in your launch, they were angry. They were representative of the segment of the whole diaspora, if you assume that, right?
I've no idea who they all were.
Because
they're just the people who managed to buy the tickets early.
The hardliners, as also some pragmatists among the diaspora, and the hardliners, they are more vociferous than the pragmatists. But you'll be seeing them in most of these meetings, forums, and all that. They are the people who will be at the front chairs. So they will be seen as the representatives of the diaspora, but that's not always true. The silent majority always, being silent.
Same with many communities, not just Tamils. Yep.
But so, was there any reflection on your launch yesterday at the university here, York University?
No, it was a fairly small event. It was more academic. Yeah.
So I wasn't there. So, do you have any spin-off projects after this?
Well, as I mentioned the play, the drama version of the book, and I mentioned Dixie's graphic novel, which are kind of, continuations. They're things that were inspired by the book, and there are a couple of people who are talking about whether they want to make a film out of it, but I don't know if that will go anywhere. So, no, I mean, apart from that, that's probably what you would expect.
How about translating your book into other languages?
Yes, of course, I forgot to tell you that one. It's being translated into Sinhala as we speak, and I think that's nearly finished. And that the hope, of course, is that people in Sri Lanka will be able to, who don't speak good English, will be able to access these stories and hopefully identify with the people on a human level. I mean, they may say, okay, where's our story? It's not in this book. Quite legitimately, and they may say, okay, you haven't seen this in the context of decades of fighting and war and suffering with the Sinhalese people too, but at least they can understand what happened to those people who were in Mullawaikul in 2009 perhaps, and perhaps they can see that they're also a mother, and they see a lady who's struggling to bring 2 children through a war, and they think, gosh, what if I was in that situation too? There may be a bit of human empathy, I hope.
Oh yes, definitely. That this, when I read this book the first time, even though I have seen enough still pictures, videos, and stories here and there, but when I read that from someone's, like you said, the horse's mouth, what really had happened by the person who was really been there, right? That made a real impact. That kind of knocked at the conscience. No matter how many times you tell that repeatedly, it will definitely wake the soul. So I think it's very important that we should propagate this into Sinhalese majority. That I think Tamil is okay, but most of them, they can read English, and they have been familiar with most of the stories, but Sinhalese, they are not, and they have never been insulated for a long time.
I think there is a Tamil translation coming out in Chennai around mid-December, and I'm going to Chennai and Delhi to promote the book in the English edition published by Penguin, and also the Tamil edition. But I think you're right, the Sinhala edition will be really important, and the kind of feedback I've had from Sri Lankan Sinhalese people who live there, I mean, very few, so I don't know if you can generalize, and of course they're the people I know, so they're probably, not the extreme ones. But I think they don't tend to deny the stories, the individual experiences, the stories of people who went through it. It's quite hard for them to deny that, and they all kind of corroborate one another. They're all different, but they all paint the same sort of picture. But what they do argue about is, what about the fact they did horrible things to us too, and all wars are dirty, and what about the scale of it, and what about this and that. So the context, the periphery of the stories they argue about and they debate, which is fine. I mean, that's okay, let them do that. But the individual suffering of those people in the 10 stories of ordinary people who went through this, they don't really know how to challenge that, and at a certain level it must sink in, and that's helpful, because if you look at this war over so many decades, I think you've got like parallel train tracks. You've got Sinhalese and Tamils whose experience of this war, their understanding of why it started, their understanding of who's the victim, their understanding of who's the perpetrator and who's right and who's wrong, and what happened at what particular month and year. It's totally different now, there's no crossing over, no intersection.
But both parties have been traveling along a scripted path. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know if it's scripted, but I mean, I can see that it's parallel and it doesn't really intersect in any way. That's the problem. So, at one point you've got to stop this, and you've got to kind of discuss why there was a war in the first place, and acknowledge all the horrible things that happened. And I really hope that in a way this book can be a starting point for people to kind of imagine what it might be like to be on the other side.
Yeah, we hope as well. In coming back to the book, there's one chapter we dedicated to Velicham, the journalist. Can you elaborate on that? Where you met him, how you heard about him, and his adventures, or not many adventures in the sense that he has been, according to your book, he has been with the people until the last few.
He was with people till April 20th, and then when Putumathlan was captured and the strip of land was split, then he had to cross over to the army side, and he had to actually break his computer and his satellite dish and all his camera and everything. He buried them and smashed them and put them in the wet sand, because he couldn't forever. He couldn't possibly take his equipment over the lagoon and surrender with his equipment and say, hey, I'm Velicham and I'm the Tamilnet correspondent, because that would have been the kiss of death.
But he was able to transmit most of this stuff to Tamilnet
until then.
No,
he had a satellite phone. He had all the gear that we have, the same sort of sophisticated
so all
broadcasting.
The rest of the stuff is in his memory now. Then he's able
well, I think he sent some of the photos out. He had them stored on the cloud or his email account or whatever. And obviously he'd sent a lot of the stuff out. But the really odd thing about Velicham was that I went to meet him. I was introduced by various people. I went to meet him, and it was very early in the morning, and I was in a country in Europe, and he opened this door to this office, and there was nobody much around except the cleaners, and I looked at him, and I was a bit sleepy. It was really early, and then we got in the lift to go to some room where we were going to do the interview, and I looked at him again, and he was looking at me, and we were looking at each other, and I thought, my God, I've seen this guy, I know this guy, I've met him before. And it just, I hadn't, he didn't know my name, and I didn't know, he didn't recognize my name, and he didn't know that he was going to know me, and I didn't know that I was going to know him. I never knew his name. And I looked at him and I was like, we've met before, haven't we? And this is really surreal. And he said, yeah. And we both sort of smiled, because it was such a magic moment to know that, you've met before, and to hook up again on the other side of the world by total chance for a different reason. And
deja vu?
yeah, it was very odd, actually. I mean, in the bigger scheme of things, it was a slight moment of relief, because obviously the stories were dreadful. But it turned out that I'd met him on the beach in Mulativu in 2004. Just after the tsunami,
right?
About a week after the tsunami, I was there. We'd been through all this, and then we bumped into Velicham, who was, I think, working for a local paper at the time, and probably not Tamilnet, because Sivaram was still alive at that point. And he said, I want to interview you. And normally, when you're a BBC correspondent and all that, you don't really give interviews, and you're not supposed to do it. But I wasn't based in Sri Lanka at the time, and it was such a sort of rare moment. It was such a devastating kind of tragedy, the tsunami, that I said, oh, all right, but I've only been here some hours, I can't, tell you an awful lot. But he wanted my reaction to what I'd seen. And so I gave him an interview, and that was it, really. I never thought about it. And then it was so sort of bizarre that years later, in this completely different part of the world, we should meet again, and this time he was giving me an interview. It was a very bizarre coincidence, but quite a nice one, quite a comforting one.
You mentioned that he was a 6-footer, and he's very athletic, and yet he was able to sneak through that the screening process. Wouldn't they have suspected him as a tiger? And with that kind of appearance and all that?
Well, I mean, there were just, 100,000 people that came out in April, and he was carrying his father, and, his father was very ill. He was incredibly lucky, I mean, he was also probably very thin and dirty, and he had a big beard, and you know, he looks healthy and strong now because he's fed enough, but in those days probably not, and he got through.
So most of his stories are still very, traumatizing to the listener itself, right? You know, so how is he coping with all this? I think he might have told you maybe 10–15% of the stories, but he still has been sleeping with all these incredible sights, you know, or whatever.
Well, I mean, one time I remember doing the interview, we were in a hotel room and there was a painting on the wall that was kind of red, sort of abstract painting, modern type thing. And he looked at it and he said, I see blood. When I see these kind of red colours, I just see blood. You know, so yes, very traumatized, very disturbed, and you know, he's obviously in the Silenced Voices film by Beate Arnstedt, you mentioned her, and I was there in Oslo when that film was previewed, it was shown for the first time, and he was sitting kind of next to me in the row with Bashner, the Sinhalese journalist, and for Lokisen, seeing that war footage that's in that film, the footage that he shot of, you know, children at their mother's body talking to them, you know, it was very disturbing footage in that film, like the Channel 4 footage. He was just weeping through the end of the film. He wept and he wept, and he couldn't handle seeing that footage. He said it's different to see it on a laptop, but when you see it on a big screen in a movie theatre, it was very, very traumatizing for him. But what was really sweet is that, you know, Bashner, who's Sinhalese, and this is a boy who grew up Lokisen in Mulativu, who'd never met Sinhalese civilians and never really engaged with them or talked to them.
Doesn't speak Sinhalese as well?
No, he doesn't speak Sinhalese, doesn't speak English, he only speaks Tamil. He grew up in war, he had a, you know, difficult childhood, and he'd only ever met Sinhalese who were pointing guns at him or in military intelligence at checkpoints on the way to Jaffna, and somehow this extraordinary friendship developed with Bashner, and Bashner was just like put his hand on his leg to try and calm him, you know, during this very distressing kind of time for the last bit of half of the film when he was just weeping and really upset. So, you know, clearly very disturbed, very traumatized. He said that when he looked through, it was very nice that he obviously lost everything, and when he came to his country of exile, his colleagues there, the foreigners, they clubbed together and they collected money and they bought him a new camera. It's a very sweet thing to do and a very nice gesture. And he took the camera home and he had a young baby, a young sort of toddler, and he thought, okay, now I'll take pictures of my child, as you would do. And he said he looked through the lens and all he could see was the images of dead children that he'd photographed during the war, children without their heads or legs and things, babies the same age, and he couldn't look through the lens. So, you know, he couldn't look through the lens of a camera, he was a photojournalist. The doctor couldn't stand the sight of blood and he was a surgeon. The nun I spoke to said that she struggled to keep her faith in God after she'd seen such evil, really. She talked about that. So all these people were really shaken in a quite sort of existential way by what they went through, and I think still are. They'll never be the same again.
Now that you have interviewed thousands of survivors.
Not thousands, obviously.
No, maybe hundreds, okay.
Not
Has
hundreds,
any one of them shown that they have the appetite for revenge?
I don't think so. I think they're really crushed. I mean, Nerian, the Norwegian Tamil fighter that I interviewed, at the end of the first time I interviewed him, he said, you know, I believe in Elam, and if I have to take up kind of arms again, I will, and so on. I wrote about it. But then the next time I saw him, he said, do you remember what I told you the last time? I was like, yeah, I will write that, don't worry, if that's what you want. But then, in a way, what his life contradicted that, because he said, no, I'm getting married, I'm engaged, and he brought this girl, his fiancée with him, and he said, you know, I'm really changed, and I go to the temple every week with her, and she's changing my life, and I feel remorse and guilt for the people I must have killed in the battle, and, you know, I don't think he actually wants to go and fight again. I mean, I think he wants to kind of honour what he did, in a sense, and not to be thought, you know, he'll stand up, he'll do his bit if he's asked to, sort of thing. But I don't think the kind of message I was getting from him is that he wants to have a normal life and he wants to put it behind him.
Let's compare this with Holocaust survivors, right? Some Jewish population, they still think that the justice has not been completed yet. The perpetrators have not been brought to justice.
Well, it's true, so there are some Nazis roaming around.
And they are individually and collectively, they are going after them and then trying to find them and all, right? So any of these surviving children from the war zone, do you think they might in future develop such things as I know the justice need to be done and we have to do something for our people, for the lost souls?
The actual survivors themselves don't want to fight again, and I think they're very, they want to kind of climb into a hole and keep away from everyone and just try and survive somehow. Their children, I do worry about in another generation, if nothing is done to put this right, how those children will grow up, the stories they will hear from Velicham, because you have to remember what, the stories of '83 and previous anti-Tamil killings, those things fueled the armed uprising in the first place, didn't they? I mean, you know that better than me.
Yeah.
So if those things that were not on the same scale as Velicham triggered this massive, armed rebellion, what could Velicham trigger in the future? I think it's very worrying. And also, if you look, you mentioned the Holocaust survivors, but it's now kind of fairly studied that there's intergenerational transmission of trauma, that even if the Holocaust survivors don't really talk about what they went through in the Holocaust, and many of them don't tell their children or grandchildren what happened because it's too horrific, they sort of bury it inside themselves, they still in a way transmit that trauma and those attitudes and ideas to their children almost subliminally, and those children suffer and the grandchildren even, and you can't go through this sort of appalling suffering and intense kind of pain and just come out the other end and be okay. And I'm not sure, if you don't deal with it, you don't have counselling, you don't have some sort of reckoning and justice and truth telling, then the children will absorb a lot of this trauma. And I think you see that even people in the diaspora are traumatized by what they've been through to become in the diaspora in the first place, why they became a refugee, but also watching this war long distance. It's very emotional, and it's very difficult even if you're not actually in the country suffering, isn't it? I mean, you tell me, you should know this.
Yeah, exactly. The diaspora itself is torn between what actions we could take in future, right? So some of them, they are focusing on war crimes, and we have to bring these people to justice and kind of revenge type of thing. And then the others think that we have to reconcile, and then we have to make peace, and then we have to have a political solution without having to, as a trade-off to war crimes. Let's get these people back to the table, and then get some. Even if it's 13th Amendment or plus or whatever, So they're torn between. So how do you see this? Any solution in the horizon you can see?
I don't see any solution. No, I don't see any solution at all. I don't see any unanimity. Obviously the situation better than me, but there's a gap between the people who are in Sri Lanka and the people who are outside. That's always the case with diasporas. Then within the diaspora, there's lots of different opinion about whether you should engage or not, or whether you should sort of stand out for more, and whether war crimes should be used as leverage to get sort of a better deal for people who are there. And at a certain level, obviously that's difficult because the suffering and the injustice is so huge. It shouldn't be a tool. Yeah. But I don't think I have any answers, and I think in a way it's not my role to tell people what they should do. I'm not Sri Lankan. It's not my country. I don't have a stake in it. I'm just an outsider. I'm a person who chronicled, the stories of what happened, so that people know. As a journalist, you do these stories. You hope it might change the world. You hope people might do something as a result. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they listen. Sometimes they ignore it. But you don't go around telling people that you've got to do this, this, this.
No, it's not telling, but at least from the third person's view, that when like I said, the diaspora is struggling to determine which way to go, and obviously they will be looking for some advice, some suggestions, some guidance.
Well, I think you need to review where it all went so terribly wrong. I mean, that's obvious.
Yeah.
So you need to.
It has to be done by both parties.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But on the diaspora side, you're outside. You can look at why democratic struggle failed, why armed struggle failed, and why the international community doesn't listen to you that much now, and why it doesn't care. I mean, you have to do a kind of thorough analysis of the situation and then work out a strategy, and it may be several different people pushing for different things, but it needs to be sort of coherent and in the same direction, I guess. That's the process of reappraisal. I think if you just do it business as usual, just carry on from where you were, that's obviously not very sensible after a catastrophe like this. I mean, I think the mood of the international community is, as you know, quite clearly not for armed struggle, not for violence. So if you pursue you know, the violent armed struggle approach. There's not going to be any friends in the international community. You're not going to win support, and it's not going to ultimately help anybody. But how you push to help people still in Sri Lanka, it's a very, very difficult situation. I don't know. I mean, I can't give you a magic answer, I'm afraid.
Anyway, yeah, so we have, I think, a minute or so left. So in conclusion, I want to read one of the phrase that you mentioned on May 2009, President Mahinda Rajapaksa as saying, you have a quote here, the troops went into this operation carrying a gun in one hand, the Human Rights Charter in the other, hostages on their shoulders, and the love of their children in their hearts. A poetic verse. Do you think it's satanic or saintly?
I think it's just not true, obviously.
It's not.
And it's just sheer propaganda. And to say that it's completely ridiculous. And many of these statements about the war were ridiculous. A zero civilian casualty policy in a war, who has ever heard of that? It was absurd, obviously, in conception, and nobody really challenged it for being kind of illogical and silly. You might not want to kill civilians. Most armies don't want to kill civilians, but that doesn't say you can have a zero civilian casualty policy and you haven't killed any. And actually, as it turns out, there's tens of thousands of civilians dead. You know, and to say you're rescuing people who don't actually want to be rescued, that's also, you know, fairly obscene as a way of describing it. And then to violate, you know, all sorts of international laws on war, to the point that the UN panel report says that the conduct of the war challenges, you know, the entire regime of humanitarian law. I mean, that's pretty heavy, isn't it? And then to say that actually we had the Human Rights Charter in one hand, I mean, it's obviously nonsense. I put it there because I thought it was interesting in the context.
Yes. Anyway, thank you very much, Ms. Harrison, for being the messenger of the truth, at least to start off. I think this book, like I said before, is attracting lots of attention from all walks of people from all walks of life, Tamils, non-Tamils, and governments, and all that, because this is the first time the survivor story came out in the form that, you know, they ought to be out. And we hope and wish success in the spin-off projects that you have been undertaking, and especially the translation of Sinhala should reach the Sinhalese masses, and then that should knock on their consciences. Thank you again for coming to the show.
Thank you for paying attention to the issues and listening to me at such length.
Great. Thanks again. Thanks very much. சரி நேயர்களே, இதோடு மிஸ்ஸஸ் ஃப்ரான்சிஸ் ஹாரிசன் அவர்களுடனான நேர்காணல் நிறைவுக்கு வருகிறது. அவருடைய புத்தகம் ஸ்டில் கவுண்டிங் த டெட் ஆங்கிலத்தில் இப்பொழுது கனேடிய தமிழ் காங்கிரஸில் பெறக்கூடியதாக இருக்கும். அதே நேரத்தில் தொடர்ந்தும் அதனுடைய பப்ளிஷர் வந்து டொரண்டோவை தளமாக கொண்டவர். அந்த வகையில் மேலதிகமான பிரதிகள் தேவை என்றால் பெற்றுக் கொடுக்கப்படும். நீங்கள் இந்த நூலை நத்தார் அன்பளிப்புகளாகவோ பரிசளிப்புகளாகவோ நான் உங்களுடைய நண்பர்களுக்கு உறவினர்களுக்கு பெற்றுக் கொடுக்கலாம். மிகவும் ஒரு முக்கியமான இறுதி நாட்கள், முள்ளிவாய்க்கால் இறுதி நாட்களை விவரிக்கும் ஒரு நூல். நிச்சயமாக வாசிக்க வேண்டிய புத்தகம். வாங்கி வாசியுங்கள். ஸ்டில் கவுண்டிங் த டெட், ஃப்ரான்சிஸ் ஹாரிசன். அவர் முன்னாள் பிபிசி ரிப்போர்ட்டராக இருந்தவர். இதோடு வெளிச்சம் நிறைவேறுகிறது. அடுத்த நிகழ்ச்சி சந்திக்கும் வரை